You don't have to be to change the world.
Hello and welcome to the Activist Investor, a podcast about shareholder activism by TulipShare, a brand new investment platform. My name is Christine and I'm the head of content at TulipShare, and this week we'll be discussing how becoming a shareholder could put an end to the plastic problems we face. And let's just say there's a lot of plastic. This week, I'm joined by Natalie Feé from City to Sea, the environmental organization dedicated to curbing plastic production once and for all. Thank you so much for joining us, Natalie.
My pleasure. Lovely to be with you and to be part of this podcast.
Could you start by telling us how City to Sea was formed and what sorts of things you've been up to recently?
Sure. Well, I had a sort of bit of a rude awakening to plastic pollution back in, I think it was around 2014. And I became aware of the problem of plastic, particularly how it was affecting the Laysan albatross chicks in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, thousands of miles away from any major landmass. And basically around a third of them were dying in their nests with their bellies full of plastic. And it was such a shocking thing to witness. It was brought to life by an amazing artist called Chris Jordan, who visited the Midway Islands and documented it in an extraordinary way that really enabled the people who saw that to just tap into some very deep feelings around how we were basically not dealing with our plastic and how it was escaping into the environment, but the devastating effect it was having. So for me, it was a sort of an emotional response. I was working in TV at the time, so I wasn't an environmental campaigner. And I just knew at that point I had to do something about it. So that was like the very initial beginnings of forming City to Sea.
So let's say you get elected Prime Minister, congratulations, and you have an unlimited budget to stop plastic pollution. Knowing what you know through the work you've done, what is step one here?
I love the idea of having an unlimited budget to tackle it. That's exciting. I think the first thing would definitely be to get what's called like an all-in deposit scheme. So some countries have got deposit schemes for plastic where you can take back your plastic items like plastic bottles and get a deposit. So get your money back for those containers. And in those countries where there is a deposit scheme, it reduces litter from things like plastic bottles by between 95 and 97%. So basically it gets rid of the problem of plastic pollution in the environment. It doesn't necessarily deal with some of the other problems around plastic, but certainly around the litter. But unfortunately in the UK, where City to Sea are based, the government have constantly delayed on this, and it's been derailed, and generally as a result of industry lobbying. So the plastics industry and the big producers of plastic push back against the government and kind of convince them to not bring in a deposit scheme, and which has just been absolutely ridiculous. So yeah, I think that's sort of, and I'd also stop lobbying in the first place because it's just a ridiculous way to run the country.
Right, so let's flip the question around a little bit. And instead of Prime Minister, you've been made CEO of Coca-Cola. Congrats again. What's step one as CEO to try and stop plastic pollution?
Wow, I'm having quite a day. I was Prime Minister just a moment ago, and now I'm the CEO of Coca-Cola.
Yeah, it's a big day.
I think, my first instinct would be to resign because I'm not sure that I'd be able to sleep at night as the CEO of Coca-Cola. Generally they have a fiduciary duty to maximise share value. So that person is accountable to the board. Obviously, it's something that TulipShare knows very well and is able to leverage that as well to some degree. But I think if I had to stay, and I probably would for a little while to see if I could make a difference, I would massively ramp up the refill and reuse target. So currently they're at around, they've set a target of 25% reusable containers by 2030. But that is not particularly ambitious. I doubt they're even going to get anywhere close to that. So I would massively ramp that up. increasing the amount of recycled content in their bottles is an interesting one. There's sort of science coming out at the moment that plastic, and especially recycled plastic, contains chemicals that are harmful to our health. And I think that we're going to see over the next 5 years a lot more information coming out on actually how bad plastic is as a container for food products. So I'd probably put a lot of money into that as well, and actually look after my customers. And on the health basis, just as a personal thing, I'd half or maybe more than half the amount of sugar in all their drinks. Definitely that. I definitely stick a refill app QR code. So we at City to See, we run the refill app, which shows people where they can refill their bottle for free wherever they go with water. And I'd make sure there was a QR code on every bottle to show that people could refill that bottle, and then in the future they could just reuse their bottles. Um, and I think I'd probably then make their water brand, Dasani, switch to a borrow return bottle. So I would be like a radical and company, and just make it borrow return. So people like at train stations or at venues or whatever would borrow a bottle, get the water in it, and then drop the bottle back at the end of the day, or keep the bottle and sort of have a deposit on the bottle. So I think there's loads of scope for innovation in that space, and it's really exciting. And there's and really the big brands should be leading that, because they've got the money to invest in the pilots and trial that stuff. So
Definitely. They've got a huge role to play as well in curbing the demand for plastic production. I mean, plastic production is actually expanding contrary to what we think is happening or should be happening. And a lot of that's down to the fact that 99% of plastic is produced by big oil through fossil fuels. And big oil, of course, are looking for new ways to save their profits. And so they're looking to plastic production. I wonder what your thoughts are on that sort of side of things, and what we have to be aware of in terms of existing plastic production chains.
yeah, definitely. I mean, that's something that we've done a lot of content on at City to See, and sort of raising awareness about the fact that plastic is basically big oil. So the big fossil fuel companies, it's their sort of hope for expansion. So we're seeing demand for global oil drop off as we're switching to EVs and so electric vehicles and renewables. But as the demand for oil drops off, the petrochemical companies are looking for, well, where can they push demand instead, so they don't lose their profits and they continue to produce as much oil as ever. So they've been looking to plastic to that, and they've been investing billions of dollars in the US. And it's if that sort of investment and continues and goes ahead, plastic production is expected to grow by 40% by 2030, and that's supposed to double plastic pollution in the ocean and massively ramp up sort of the amount of oil used globally by the petrochemical industry. So it's not a pretty picture, and it's something that as the climate movement gathers strength, sort of at COP, for example, back in October up in Glasgow, plastic wasn't even really on the agenda. It didn't even get a mention, yet it's sort of behind the scenes. That's where they're kind of investing massively in that, whilst people are looking to the more obvious CO2 polluters like aviation, construction, those sort of industries, and not so much looking at plastics. But I think that will shift, and I think really,
I mean, it kind of has to shift, or we're starting to run out of room for all this plastic.
Well, yeah, and I mean, hopefully we're actually going to run out of oil at some point as well, so it won't even be an option. But before we get to that point, we need to be transitioning away from single use altogether. We basically just can't keep burning through the earth's resources and seeing it as throwaway. We have to shift to a more circular economy where we value our resources and keep those resources in circulation for generations to come.
So my next question is, does recycling work, or is it a mirage? Should we keep recycling?
It's a really complicated question. Well, it's not a complicated question, Christine. It's a complicated answer. I mean, basically, yes, we should be recycling. We should definitely be recycling, but unfortunately, the recycling system, particularly in the UK, is broken. We're exporting around 2/3 of the plastic that we collect in this country abroad, and that in itself is hugely problematic, not just because a lot of the countries that we export that plastic to don't have the correct infrastructure to process that plastic, but also it's known as waste colonialism, the effect of us sort of in the Western countries exporting our plastic exports to lower income countries in the majority world is basically having effects on the human health and the environment in those countries, and it's disproportionately felt by communities of colour. So there's a sort of environmental justice element to us exporting our plastic, as well as an environmental problem with it. And unfortunately, a lot of the other plastic that we gather for recycling in the UK is incinerated here in the UK. So it's kind of a massive con at the moment. It doesn't mean we should stop doing it, but we really, really do need our government to ban those plastic waste exports and stop building these new incinerators. So that's things that, where we as people who are voting, with people with MPs that they can write to, can have a voice and can have some influence, and sort of getting behind organisations like Greenpeace and ourselves at City to See are ways that we can help to influence the government and to raise awareness about that, and so people know what they can do and what power they might have.
So we touched briefly already on fossil fuel expansion and how 99% of plastics are produced from fossil fuels, and big oil are using plastics to try to expand their profits. And I wondered, what's your best case scenario for the next 20 years? How can we turn this around and make it into a good news story?
I think the best case scenario is that governments around the world actually step up and set these legally binding targets that we need to eliminate single-use plastic. Because as I said earlier, the fossil fuel industry is massively investing in plastics from petrochemicals. So we don't obviously want that to happen. But as long as we are force-fed the amount of single-use plastic that we're using, and as long as there's not any legislation around that, then we're going to continue to use it. So I think the best case scenario is that those legally binding targets are set to sort of ban a lot of the single-use plastic in globally. There are deposit return schemes for the plastic that is in existence. And I think really, if I'm dreaming big, there's a serious amount of funding put into the right infrastructure for this circular economy to really take hold, and for it to become mainstream, it has to be really affordable. There have been a few trials, in supermarkets in the UK where you can get your goods in returnable containers, but you put a deposit on each item. If you've got 10 items with a £2 deposit on, quite quickly that's going to add a significant amount to your weekly shopping. Although you can get that money back, some people might not have a spare 20 quid that they can spend that week on their deposit items. So there are a few barriers that we need to address. So I think, dreaming big, I would see government and big retailers and the big producers actually putting money into refill and reuse systems so that we can live in that future and it can be fair and accessible to everybody.
Yeah, definitely. And this isn't something I was planning to ask, but I think about this sometimes because plastic was only invented in the 1950s, and I often wonder if we can just go backwards and try to get our goods and foods without plastic being involved. Do you think there are any answers we can find from looking backwards, or is it not really scalable now with our way of life and bigger population?
I think it's definitely scalable, but generally the thing with innovation and what we call progress is it doesn't ever go backwards, because people get more and more used to the convenience. So, previously we didn't really have refrigerators, so we would have walked to our local shops, and generally back then it was generally the women that would have been at home looking after the kids and doing the cooking. They would walk to the shops pretty much every day. They'd have their social interactions with people from the shops. They'd get their fresh meat because it couldn't be refrigerated. It would be wrapped in paper. They'd get their milk, they'd get their groceries, and they'd pretty much buy what they needed for that day or for the next couple of days. Whereas now we go to the supermarket, most of the time we drive there. You buy enough food to last you a week, possibly longer. A load of that food gets wasted, and most of it's wrapped in plastic. A lot of it goes in the fridge. So we've lost the sort of local high street element here in the UK, and so I think it's quite difficult for us to go back to that way of living. But we can certainly learn from how we did things in terms of like the reusable and the sort of non-harmful packaging as well that we used.
Yeah, well, I definitely don't have time to go to the store every single morning, so I see your point there.
No, exactly.
Final question, can you name any companies who are doing a good job when it comes to curbing plastic pollution?
Yeah, I had to think about this question, and it was very difficult to think of like large corporates. There are some that are doing trials here and there, but for me it was easier to think of companies who are actually like powering the change. So we have a cafe chain. It's an independent cafe chain in Bristol, but it's across the southwest and a bit beyond. And they actually got rid of single-use coffee cups altogether back in 2018. So they literally overnight said, right, we are not using any single-use coffee cups at all, and they introduced reusable cups. So if anyone wanted to take away coffee, they had to get it in a reusable cup with a deposit and had to bring it back to the store, or keep the cup. So that was very progressive of them and quite radical. They lost a lot of customers overnight, but over time that's built back up again. And so, yeah, they very much valued planet and people over profit in that example. So I'm proud of them and what they did, and lots of us are learning from them.
I didn't know that about Boston Tea Party. It's awesome.
Yeah, it's very cool. I think sort of water bottle brands, so Chili's bottles, for example, they've been part of the kind of creating that trend, making carrying and refilling your water bottle more desirable, like over the past 5 years, coming up with great innovation and designs. They've also been a big part of supporting the refill campaign. So I think, they're helping to make plastic bottled water a thing of the past by inspiring people to carry reusables. And the other thing I was thinking about was like period products. So lots of people don't realise that how much hidden plastic there is in conventional period products. So the average pack of period pads contains the same amount of plastic as 5 carrier bags, which is really quite shocking for people because you wouldn't necessarily think that when you're looking at a pad.
Wow, that is a stat I was not aware of.
Yeah, so brands like Moon Cup and Nature Care who like offer reusable options. So Moon Cup do a reusable cup or plastic-free options. Those really are the sort of pioneers in the space, and they're stopping millions of pieces of plastic entering the ecosystem every month and generally making our periods a lot healthier. So kudos to them.
Well, that is all the time we have for today. Natalie, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. And thanks for all the work you guys are doing at Tulip Share. It's really exciting to be a part of that as well.
And likewise to City to Sea. Well, if you enjoyed this week's podcast, don't forget you can subscribe to the Activist Investor wherever you find your podcast.
Share.
Things you care about. It's really important.